Get ready this week. It's going to be one of the wildest readings so far in the Bible in a year. We're transitioning and wrapping up Deuteronomy to the book of Joshua. And this, we see finally, Israel is stepping into the promised land. And this week's readings, it's got a lot of major transitions. It's got epic battles, some of the hardest lessons on obedience that we're going to read about so far as well. It's going to be amazing. I want to let you know also, I'll be releasing a separate video on an introduction to the book of Joshua. So check that out when it's available. I'll have a link in the description below. But let's get into three major highlights that we're going to read about and come across this week. The first highlight is the transition from Moses to Joshua. Now, Moses has led Israel for 40 years. Now he's passing on the leadership to Joshua. This is significant because it's not just about change in leadership. It's about trusting that God's leadership, his ways, are not lying in just one person called Moses. It's big for Israel here. So Deuteronomy 31, we see that God is commissioning Joshua through Moses to lead Israel in strength, in courage, in obedience. And this transition sets the stage for everything that follows from here on out. Now, in the second highlight, we see that Israel becomes a people of warriors. From wandering in the desert to a people of warriors, we see them cross the Jordan similar to the way they crossed the Red Sea. Immediately, they're faced with the walls of Jericho, their first major battle. But the victories aren't just about military strength. They're about obedience to God's instructions. So in the battles that follow, we see the marching around Jericho in a specific way, the setting of ambushes on AI. Everything requires God's full obedience, often in real time. And the third highlight here is the failure to fully obey God to drive out all the inhabitants from the lands. Israel, they won many battles, but they didn't always follow through completely with the command to drive out all the inhabitants. So we're going to read about the Gideonite deception, where they make a treaty with Israel. We read about the Jebusites, the Canaanites that are not fully driven out. And this is going to have consequences later on, leading to future struggles with idolatry and corruption. Now let's look at three key themes as we read along this week. The first one, be strong and courageous. In Joshua 1, God tells Joshua 3 times, be strong and courageous. And this isn't just about facing physical battles. It's about trusting in God in the midst of overwhelming challenges. And just as Joshua needed that strong, courageous spirit to lead Israel, we need to be strong and courageous in our faith today. So what's one area of your life that you need to be strong and courageous in that God is leading you through right now? The second theme, the concept of devoted to destruction. Now, this is one of the hardest parts in the book of Joshua, God's command to completely destroy all the inhabitants of the land. And while this can seem harsh, it is about absolute allegiance to God. These nations were deeply entrenched in idolatry. They're from the seed of the serpent. They are against God. And in our lives, we're called to put to death anything that competes with God for our devotions, Colossians 3:5. So what is God calling you to remove from your life to fully follow him? The third theme here is listening for God's instructions. Listening for God's instructions. Joshua's success wasn't about his own wisdom. It was about listening to God, his precise instructions that he had from him along the way, step by step. And the same is true for us today. God's guidance is available for us, but we have to listen to it, listen for it, I should say, and obey it. So are you giving space to hear God's instructions in your life? Next, let's zoom out for this supernatural worldview perspective that we do each week. And this week, it's about not just a conquest of physical battle, but it's a spiritual one. Deuteronomy 32:8-9 reveals to us that God had disinherited the nations outside of Israel, assigning them to lesser spiritual beings. He is aligning himself with Israel. The people of this land were not just random inhabitants. They were aligned with the seed of the serpent, those in direct rebellion against God's rule. This theme goes all the way back to Genesis 3:15. So in this, the conquest of Canaan is about reclaiming territory for God through his chosen people, driving out those that represented opposition to God's kingdom. This ties directly back to this theme of devoted to destruction. It's the removal of nations for a spiritual purification, and that eliminates also strongholds in idolatry and allegiance outside of God. So just as Israel had to drive out these forces, we are called to drive out anything in our lives that is in opposition to God's reign. This is not just about external enemies. It's about spiritual battles and spiritual warfares along the way. We must be mindful of these things in the background as we're reading about physical things happening on earth. So this week challenges us to obey God fully, to recognize God's leadership, to be strong and courageous in the things that we face. So take a moment. Reflect on what God is calling you to be strong and courageous in. What do you fully need to surrender to God in your thoughts, in your actions? Share those things, if you would, in the comments below. Let's talk about this. What stands out to you in this week's reading? And if this has encouraged you in any way in these weeks before, this week now, would you subscribe? Would you share this to your friends and family? Let's grow in God's word together, and we'll be back next week for more.